The key turned in the lock with a slick metallic snick that sounded deafeningly final in the afternoon quiet of the cabin. Ethan Hayes didn't move. He stood by the stone fireplace, one hand resting on the cool, river-worn mantle his grandfather had built, and listened. Outside, the gravel on the path crunched under the determined, expensive walking shoes of a woman who had confused power with righteousness. A shadow fell across the screened-in porch door. "Ethan, I know you're in there," a voice sliced through the air, thin and sharp as a shard of glass. "The Community Covenants, Section 4, Subsection B, clearly state that all unapproved. Exterior meetings must be registered with the Architectural Review Committee. I can see his car. This is your final warning before I document this illegal gathering." The doorknob rattled, a furious, impotent, brass-on-brass shiver. Ethan's guest, a man in a perfectly tailored but unassuming gray suit, raised an eyebrow. He'd been in the middle of a sentence about state water rights, the condensation from his glass of iced tea leaving a perfect ring on a coaster. He paused, a faint smile touching his lips. He'd seen this kind of small-town tyranny before. What he hadn't seen was the absolute calm on Ethan's face. The rattling stopped. A heavy sigh of exasperation followed, the kind of sound a queen makes when a peasant fails to bow low enough. Then a new sound, the thin, plastic scrape of a credit card being forced into the door jamb. The man in the suit leaned forward, his voice a low whisper. "Is she attempting to break into your home?" "She calls it a compliance inspection," Ethan murmured back, his eyes fixed on the straining wood of the doorframe. "But you and I, General, we might call it something else." The word General hung in the air, potent and heavy. The credit card snapped. A frustrated yelp echoed from the porch, followed by the sound of a fist hammering against the solid oak. That was it. The moment the battle was truly lost and won, she had just committed breaking and entering in front of the State Attorney General of Missouri, and she had no idea. Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far this kind of HOA power reaches. This isn't just my fight anymore. It's yours too. 6 months earlier, there was no fight. There was only the low hum of cicadas in the Ozark timber and the gentle lapping of Table Rock Lake against the old wooden dock. Ethan Hayes had come to his grandfather's cabin not to wage a war, but to escape one. After 15 years as a forensic accountant for the Department of Defense, auditing black budgets and tracking ghost assets through the labyrinthine corridors of global conflict, he craved simplicity. He wanted the smell of cedar in the morning, the taste of coffee, brewed with well water, the feel of a worn flannel shirt against his skin. His grandfather had built this cabin with his own hands after coming home from Korea, a sanctuary of hand-hewn logs and quiet dignity on a plot of land his family had owned since the 1920s. The trouble, as it often does, arrived in a golf cart. It was a pristine hunter-green club car that whined up his gravel driveway, its electric motor an irritating counterpoint to the song of a nearby Carolina wren. Behind the wheel sat Brenda Davenport, the self-appointed queen of the Serenity, Cove Estates Homeowners Association. She was a woman in her late 50s who wore her authority like a too-tight pastel polo shirt, her face a permanent mask of pinched disapproval under a white visor. Her own house, visible across the cove, was a beige McMansion, a monument to soulless conformity with a lawn so unnaturally green it looked like it had been spray-painted. The air around her smelled faintly of chlorine and self-dash importance. Ethan was on his dock, sanding a rough patch on a railing, the scent of sawdust and lake water filling his lungs. He watched her approach, her movements sharp and bird-like. She didn't get out of the cart. She just pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a small, weathered birdhouse his grandmother had painted decades ago, a cheerful, if slightly peeling, blue. "That's a violation," she announced. Her voice carrying across the 50 feet of lawn between them. Ethan straightened up, the sandpaper feeling rough in his palm. "I'm sorry?" "The birdhouse," she clarified, as if speaking to a child. Article 7. All exterior decorations must be of a neutral, earth-toned palette. That blue is aggressive. She said the word aggressive, as if the birdhouse had personally insulted her. He looked at the tiny, faded blue box, then back at her. This was his welcome to the neighborhood. Not a casserole, not a handshake. A citation for a birdhouse. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me. That first warning was just a probe, a tactical reconnaissance mission to gauge his defenses. In his old job, Ethan had seen it 1,000 times. The initial, seemingly trivial test of compliance before the real offensive begins. He took the birdhouse down, not because he agreed, but because he'd chosen this place for peace, and a gallon of beige paint seemed a small price to pay. He was wrong. Appeasement only emboldens a tyrant. The next salvo came a week later. Another certified letter delivered by a mailman who now refused to make eye contact. This one was about his dock. "The structure," the letter read in Brenda's officious, cursive-like font, "is of a non-uniform, rustic construction, inconsistent with the updated community aesthetic guidelines." It was the same dock that had been there for 68 years. His grandfather had driven every nail. Ethan had learned to fish from it, had cannonballed off it on scorching July afternoons, had even carved his initials into one of the support posts when he was 10. The wood was silvered with age, solid as ironwood. To him, it smelled of history, of family. To Brenda, it was an eyesore. A $200 fine was attached. This time, Ethan didn't reach for a paintbrush. He reached for the binder of HOA covenants she'd so thoughtfully provided when he'd moved in. He spent an entire evening at his grandfather's old oak desk, the smell of old paper and stale coffee filling the small room. A single lamp casting a golden pool of light over the documents. He read every line, every bylaw, every amendment. He was no longer a man seeking peace. He was an auditor, and he'd just opened a new case file. The Serenity Cove Estates, HOA. The following Saturday, Brenda's golf cart whined up his driveway again. She held a clipboard like a scepter. "Mr. Hayes, your fine for the non-compliant dock is now past due. A late fee has been assessed." Ethan walked out to meet her holding a cup of coffee. He took a slow sip, the bitter, hot liquid a small comfort. "Actually, Brenda, it's not." He gestured with his mug toward the far side of the cove. "According to Article 9, Section C, which you cited, the bylaws must be applied uniformly to all residents. The Henderson's dock, 3 lots down, has twice as many weathered boards, and Mr. Gable's floating platform is literally held, together with blue plastic barrels. I took photos." He smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "In legal terms, it's called selective enforcement. When an HOA board knowingly ignores violations by some residents while penalizing others, for the same thing, it renders the rule itself legally unenforceable. So, you can either withdraw my fine, or we can have a longer conversation that includes my lawyer and a formal petition to the board to enforce the rule against Mr. Gable, who I believe is your Saturday bridge partner." The color drained from Brenda's face. The pinched look intensified, her lips a thin, white line. He'd just dropped his first knowledge bomb, a small tactical strike, and it had hit its target perfectly. She hadn't expected him to read the rules, let alone understand how to use them against her. The silence stretched, broken only by the buzz of a dragonfly hovering over the water. She snatched the clipboard back, her knuckles white. "This isn't over," she hissed, and the golf cart whirred away, spitting gravel. He knew she was right. This was just the beginning. The fight had escalated from a simple citation to a direct challenge to her authority. And for a woman like Brenda Davenport, a challenge like that was not just a legal matter. It was a declaration of war. What would You have done in my place? Drop it in the comments. The retaliation was petty, insidious, and relentless. His trash cans, left at the curb for pickup, were reported for being out 35 minutes past the 6 p.m. deadline. A new fine appeared. He received a notice that the native wildflowers growing near his property line, wildflowers that had been there since before the HOA existed, were technically weeds and needed to be professionally removed. Another fine. He started to feel a constant low-grade sense of being watched. He'd be reading on his porch and catch a glint of light from Brenda's deck across the water. The distinct reflection of binoculars dot the air in his sanctuary no longer felt pure. It was tainted with the metallic scent of impending conflict. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was tense, the silence before a storm. He was sleeping less, the analytical part of his brain, the part he'd tried to shut off, whirring back to life. He started treating it like an audit. He documented everything. He took time-stamped photos of his trash cans. He got a botanist from the state university to certify that his weeds were, in fact, protected native pollinators. He was building a case file, just like he would for a corrupt defense contractor. The deeper he dug, the uglier it got. He spoke to his neighbors, quietly at first. He spoke to old Mrs. Gable, a widow with kind eyes and a tremor in her hands, who admitted she paid Brenda's nephew $200 a month for landscaping services. She didn't need just to stay off the HOA's radar. He spoke to the Millers, a young family who were fined because their toddler's plastic slide was visible from the road. The color? Aggressive yellow? The common theme was fear. Brenda's power wasn't just in the bylaws, it was in the social fabric of the community. Her husband, it turned out, sat on the county zoning commission. A complaint from Brenda could turn into a real problem with permits and property taxes. She was untouchable. One rainy Tuesday, while searching for an old property survey in his grandfather's roll-top desk. Ethan's fingers brushed against a leather-bound folio he'd overlooked before. It felt heavy, important. The leather was cool and supple under his touch, the air filled with the rich, musty scent of aged paper and binding glue. He opened it carefully. Inside, protected by vellum paper, was not a simple survey. It was the original 1958 plat map for the entire subdivision, back when it was just called Hickory Point Landing. Tucked inside the folio was the original deed, signed by the developer and the county clerk. He scanned the dense, typewritten text, his eyes catching a specific covenant, one that predated the Serenity Cove Estates HOA by nearly 40 years. A clause about riparian rights and permanent grandfathered access for all original plots. He didn't understand its full significance yet, but his auditor's instinct told him this document was ammunition. He carefully placed it back in the desk, a seed of a strategy beginning to form in his mind. The breaking point, the act of illegal aggression that would set the final confrontation in motion, came on a sweltering August afternoon. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of hot pine needles and imminent rain. Ethan received a certified letter. His hands were slick with sweat as he tore it open. It wasn't a fine. It was a notice of special assessment. The HOA board, which consisted of Brenda and two of her cronies, had voted to approve a $75,000 emergency shoreline fortification project. The letter claimed that severe erosion was threatening the community's property values. And due to the location of the supposed erosion, the cost was being levied solely upon 3 homeowners, Ethan and his 2 elderly neighbors. His share? $15,000. Due in 30 days. He felt a cold dread wash over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since he uncovered a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme in a Baghdad reconstruction project. He walked down to his shoreline. The stones were hot under his boots. There was no emergency. There was no severe erosion. There was the same gentle, grassy slope that had been there his entire life. The only thing that had changed was a new set of survey stakes hammered into the ground a few feet from his dock dot, and then he saw it. The detail that turned this from a corrupt money grab into a personal vendetta. Printed at the bottom of the assessment letter under the heading of approved contractor was a name, Davenport Construction, LLC. A quick search on his laptop confirmed it. The company was owned by Brenda's brother-in-law. This wasn't shoreline protection. This was a direct illegal pipeline from his bank account into her family's pockets. It was fraud. It was a takedown attempt, meant to either bankrupt him or force him to sell the one place on earth he considered home. He stood there, the fraudulent letter trembling in his hand, the smell of the coming storm mixing with the scent of the lake. He looked across the water at Brenda's sterile palace. She had misjudged him. She saw a quiet man who wanted to be left alone. She didn't see the auditor who had brought down generals and dismantled empires of deceit. She thought this was her kingdom. She was about to find out it was his battlefield, and he never lost. The fraudulent assessment letter didn't feel like paper. It felt like a declaration of war, the crisp edges sharp enough to draw blood. Ethan Hayes laid it on his grandfather's desk, the black ink a stark stain against the warm, aged oak. The immediate hot surge of anger was something he recognized, a combat response. But his training took over, cooling the rage into icy, methodical precision. You don't charge a fortified position head-on. You perform reconnaissance, identify weaknesses, and gather intelligence. His first targets were not Brenda or her sham construction company. They were the other names on the assessment list, Garrison and Chen. He found the Garrisons first. Their cabin was a small, tidy A-frame, choked by overgrown rose bushes that smelled sweet and funereal in the humid air. Arthur Garrison, a man whose spine had been bent by 80 years of hard work, answered the door. His wife Helen peered from behind him, her face a road map of worry. The air inside their home smelled of mothballs and baked bread. When Ethan showed them his copy of the assessment, Helen's hand flew to her mouth, a small choked sound escaping her lips. We don't have that kind of money, Mr. Hayes, Arthur said, his voice a dry rasp like leaves skittering on pavement. Our pension, it barely covers the taxes as it is. This place, it's all we have to leave the grandkids. The scent of their fear was more potent than the roses. It was the smell of helplessness, a scent Brenda Davenport surely savored. Ethan saw in their eyes the real cost of this HOA scandal. It wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. Mr. Chen, a retired chemistry professor who lived 2 lots down, was a different story. His cabin was minimalist, surrounded by a meticulously raked Zen garden. He listened to Ethan's explanation. With unnerving stillness, his hands folded. The air in his home was clean, with a faint antiseptic smell of lemon oil. She does this every few years, Mr. Chen said, his voice calm and detached. She targets those she perceives as weak or unwilling to fight. The elderly, the newcomers. It is, from a strategic standpoint, efficient. He adjusted his glasses. I will not pay it. I also will not fight it publicly. My late wife cherished the quiet here. I will not dishonor her memory with vulgar conflict. He was a conscientious objector in a war he knew he couldn't avoid. Ethan left their homes with a heavy weight in his chest. This was no longer just his fight. He was now defending the Garrison's legacy and the memory of Mr. Chen's wife. He had his mission. The next morning he drove to the county records office. The building smelled of damp concrete and dusty paper, a scent he knew well. He spent 8 hours scrolling through microfilm, the whir of the machine a familiar soundtrack to his hunt. He pulled the incorporation documents for Serenity Cove Estates HOA and the business license for Davenport Construction LLC. The ink on the construction license was barely a year old. The registered agent was Brenda's brother-in-law, and the address was a P.O. box, a classic shell. He then pulled the HOA's tax filings. Their reserve funds, which should have been robust, were critically low. There were a series of consulting and management fees paid out to another LLC he didn't recognize. He jotted down the name. Another thread to pull. While Ethan was digging, Brenda launched her smear campaign. It was a classic psychological warfare operation. He'd be working in his yard, and neighbors who used to wave would now turn away, suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. He overheard snippets of conversation at the local marina's supply shop. Some kind of government agent, I heard, fired for instability. And suing the whole neighborhood, trying to dissolve the HOA so he can build some monstrosity. The lies were as thick and suffocating as the summer humidity. Then came the sabotage. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a fine for an oil spot on his gravel driveway the size of a quarter, a warning that the smoke from his weekend barbecue was a nuisance pollutant. His newspaper started disappearing from the end of his drive. One morning, he woke up to find the valve for his water main had been shut off. Each incident was small, deniable, but together they formed a relentless pattern of harassment designed to wear him down, to make his sanctuary feel like a prison. He felt a constant grinding tension, the taste of adrenaline always at the back of his throat. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. He knew he couldn't win a war of attrition. He needed to force a confrontation. Using a clause in the bylaws about homeowner-requested meetings, he formally petitioned for a special session of the HOA. He gave the reason as discussion of the recent special assessment and potential board member conflicts of interest. He knew Brenda couldn't legally refuse. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile room that smelled of pine-scented cleaner and desperation. About 30 residents sat on uncomfortable folding chairs. Brenda and her two board cronies, a smug-looking man named Gary and a perpetually nervous woman named Carol, sat at a long table at the front. Brenda ran the meeting with an iron fist, her gavel striking the table with sharp, angry cracks. When it was his turn to speak, Ethan walked to the front, not with a stack of papers, but with a single sheet. He felt the hostile stares, the weight of their judgment. He kept his voice calm, level, the same tone he used when briefing a 4-star general. "I'm not here to talk about my dock or my trash cans," he began. "I'm here to talk about our money." He laid out the facts. The $75,000 assessment. The fact that Davenport Construction was a brand new entity owned by Brenda's family. The fact that the company had no public record of ever completing a construction project. He could feel the mood in the room shift, the scent of stale coffee mixing with a new smell. Doubt. "This is slander," Brenda snapped, her face flushing, a deep, mottled red. "This is a private business matter, approved by the board for the good of the community. It stops being a private matter when you use our funds to enrich your own family, Brenda," Ethan countered, his voice hardening. "That's called self-dealing. And when an HOA board engages in blatant self-dealing and fails to observe the basic corporate formalities like getting competitive bids for a major project, it opens up the board members to personal liability." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. He then looked directly at Gary and Carol, whose smiles had vanished. This was it. The second knowledge bomb. "It's a legal principle called piercing the corporate veil," he said, making sure everyone could hear. "It means that if a board acts in a fraudulent or grossly negligent manner, homeowners can sue the board members as individuals, not the HOA, you, personally. Your houses, your cars, your retirement accounts, they're all on the line." A gasp went through the room. Carol looked like she was going to be physically ill. Gary's smug expression had melted into slack-jawed panic. They had followed Brenda blindly, assuming the HOA structure protected them. Ethan had just stripped away their armor, leaving them exposed and terrified. He had turned Brenda's own lieutenants against her. For a moment, he thought he'd won. The seeds of rebellion had been planted. But as he watched Brenda, he saw something in her eyes beyond fury. It was desperation. He caught a glimpse of it a few days later. He was heading to his car when he saw Brenda and her husband, the county commissioner, arguing on their deck. Their voices were low but sharp, carrying across the still water. Her husband's face was pale, his shoulders slumped. "The state audit is next week, Brenda. We can't afford this kind of attention. I told you to be discreet," he heard him hiss before they went inside. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The aggression, the blatant fraud, the desperation. They were in financial trouble. The assessment wasn't just about power or greed. It was a lifeline. And a drowning person will pull everyone under with them. That's when Brenda deployed her nuclear option. Ethan had believed the fight was contained within the HOA's rules. He was wrong. Brenda had a bigger gun, and she was about to use it. A week after the meeting, a county sheriff's deputy, a young man with an apologetic look on his face, served him with an official notice. The paper felt cold and heavy in his hand, the ink smelling of bureaucratic finality. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from the Lake and County Zoning Commission, her husband's commission. It was a notice of condemnation and removal. The document claimed that a recent survey had uncovered a previously unrecorded navigational channel easement running directly through his property, right where his dock stood. The dock was now deemed an illegal impediment to public navigation and had to be removed at his expense within 14 days, or the county would do it and bill him for the demolition. It was a staggering, brilliant, and utterly illegal move. She had fabricated a government document. She had weaponized her husband's office to bypass the HOA and attack him directly. The air rushed out of his lungs. The sounds of the lake, the birds, the wind in the pines, it all faded into a dull roar in his ears. He looked at the official county seal on the paper. How do you fight a ghost? How do you disprove an easement that never existed but is now? On an official piece of paper? He felt the bitter taste of defeat. He had won the battle at the HOA meeting, but she had just escalated the conflict to a level he couldn't possibly fight alone. If you think HOAs should be held accountable type. Yes, so we can get this trending. For a full day, he was adrift. He sat on his porch, the condemnation notice on the table beside him, watching the sun set over the water, the sky bleeding into bruised shades of orange and purple. The smell of the lake, which had once brought him peace, now smelled of loss. He had underestimated her ruthlessness. He had played by the rules of a game she had no intention of honoring. But as darkness fell, the auditor in him woke up. The soldier. The man who hunted enemies of the state through impenetrable jungles of paperwork. He had been fighting defensively, reacting to her moves. It was time to go on the offensive. He couldn't fight the county commission from the bottom up, so he would have to bring down hell from the top down. He went back to his grandfather's desk. He pushed aside the HOA bylaws and the fraudulent assessment. He pulled out the leather-bound folio with the original 1958 plat map and deed. He ran his finger over the clause about riparian rights, water rights. Water rights, especially on a federal body of water like Table Rock Lake, weren't a county issue. They were a state and federal issue. Brenda's husband had overstepped his authority in a catastrophic way. Ethan spent the next 48 hours in a fever of activity. He compiled everything into a single, cohesive, undeniable dossier. The illegal assessment, the shell construction company, the evidence of self-dealing, the sworn affidavits he'd collected from the garrisons and other harassed neighbors, the fabricated county condemnation notice, and, as the crown jewel, a certified copy of the 1958 deed, highlighting the state-recognized water rights that her husband's commission had no jurisdiction to override. He created a timeline, a money trail, A clear and irrefutable narrative of corruption, conspiracy, and fraud. He didn't send it to a local lawyer. He didn't send it to the county prosecutor, who was probably a friend of the Davenports. He made a call to a former colleague from his DOD days, a man who now worked high up in the state's public integrity section. He explained the situation. His friend was silent for a long moment, then let out a low whistle. "This stinks to high heaven, Ethan. The zoning commission angle, that's public corruption. That gets our attention." Then, Ethan took his final decisive step. He bundled his entire dossier into a secure digital file. He addressed it not to a clerk or a junior assistant, but directly to the personal office of the one man in the state, with the power to bring the full weight of the law down on the Davenports, the one man who could dismantle their entire small-town empire. A week later, his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number with a Jefferson City area code. "Mr. Hayes, this is Sarah Jenkins, Chief of Staff for the Missouri Attorney General's office. The General has personally reviewed the file you sent. He finds the evidence of public corruption and consumer fraud to be compelling. He's going to be in the Table Rock area next week for a conference and would like to meet with you personally to discuss it. Would that be possible?" Ethan looked out the window of his cabin at the dock that was scheduled for demolition in 3 days. He looked across the water at Brenda Davenport's McMansion. What they did next almost made me lose everything, but it also gave me the win of my life. "Yes," Ethan said, his voice steady and clear. "Of course, my cabin is very private. It would be the perfect place to meet." The air inside the cabin was still and cool, a stark contrast to the oppressive pre-storm humidity pressing in from the outside. The scent of rain-soaked earth and pine drifted through the screened windows. Ethan Hayes and his guest, Attorney General Marcus Miller, sat in worn leather armchairs. Miller, a man whose calm demeanor belied a prosecutor's mind, held the leather-bound folio containing the 1958 deed, his fingertips tracing the embossed title. "This document," Miller said, his voice a low, resonant baritone, "is what we in the legal profession call a linchpin. It's the foundational covenant. Any subsequent rules made by a homeowners association that contradict these original deeded rights are likely void." He looked up at Ethan, a glint of appreciation in his eyes. "You did your homework, Mr. Hayes. Most people just pay the fine." "I was an auditor," Ethan replied, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I was trained to believe that if something doesn't add up, it's usually because someone is hiding the truth in a second set of books. The HOA's bylaws were their official story. This," he nodded at the folio, "is the truth." A low electric whine cut through the afternoon quiet, growing steadily louder. The sound grated on Ethan's nerves, a familiar harbinger of conflict. It was the sound of Brenda Davenport's golf cart, climbing his gravel driveway like an invasive insect. Miller raised an eyebrow. "Showtime?" he asked. "Showtime," Ethan confirmed, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He'd rehearsed this moment in his mind a dozen times, but the reality of it, the final, irreversible confrontation, still sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. The cart stopped. A car door slammed, Brenda's, and then the crunch of gravel. Under her determined stride, they heard her march up the wooden steps to the porch. A shadow fell across the door. Then, her voice, sharp and imperious, sliced through the air. "Ethan, I know you're in there," she called out, the sound muffled slightly by the door. "The Community Covenants, Section 4, Subsection B, clearly state that all unapproved exterior meetings must be registered with the Architectural Review Committee. I can see his car. This is your final warning before I document this illegal gathering." Miller leaned back, a flicker of amusement on his face. He'd prosecuted hardened criminals and corrupt politicians who had more subtlety. Then came the rattle of the doorknob, a furious, impotent sound. Ethan met Miller's gaze. The highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the state was about to witness firsthand, the petty tyranny he'd only read about in Ethan's file. The rattling stopped, a frustrated sigh, and then the thin, scraping sound of a credit card being worked into the door jamb. Miller's amusement vanished, replaced by a look of clinical focus. He whispered, "Is she attempting to break into your home?" "She calls it a compliance inspection," Ethan murmured back, his heart hammering against his ribs. "But you and I, General, we might call it something else." The sharp snap of plastic breaking echoed from the porch, followed by an unladylike curse. Then a fist hammered against the solid oak door. Whump, whump, whump. That was the final nail. She had crossed the line from civil harassment to criminal action. Ethan stood, his movements deliberate. He walked to the door, the old wooden floorboards barely creaking. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and impending justice. He turned the deadbolt with a loud, definitive clack and pulled the door open. Brenda Davenport stood there, her face flushed with rage, a broken piece of a credit card still clutched in her hand. Her eyes were narrowed, ready to spew another paragraph of HOA legalese, but the words died in her throat. She froze, her gaze shifting from Ethan to the man in the tailored gray suit rising from the armchair behind him. Her eyes widened, a flicker of confusion warring with her anger. She recognized him from news conferences, from campaign billboards. But it didn't make sense. It couldn't be. "Brenda," Ethan said, his voice devoid of all emotion, "I'd like you to meet a guest of mine. This is Marcus Miller, the Attorney General for the state of Missouri." The name hit her like a physical blow. The color drained from her face, leaving a pasty, sickly white. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The carefully constructed world of petty rules and absolute power she had built around herself shattered in an instant. "Mrs. Davenport," General Miller said, his voice dangerously soft as he stepped onto the porch. He held up a small leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gold badge. "My office has been conducting an investigation into numerous allegations of fraud, conspiracy, and public corruption originating from the Serenity Cove estates. Your timing is impeccable. We were just discussing you." Brenda stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her throat. This is private property," she stammered, falling back on her only known defense. "HOA business. You have no jurisdiction here." "Ordinarily, you might be right," Miller conceded, taking another step closer. The air crackled with tension. But when an HOA uses the U.S. mail to send fraudulent financial assessments for a non-existent emergency to be fulfilled by a shell company owned by your brother-in-law, that becomes felony mail fraud. That's my jurisdiction. He ticked the points off on his fingers. When you conspire with your husband, a public official, to fabricate a county condemnation order to intimidate a homeowner, that becomes conspiracy to commit fraud and public corruption. Also my jurisdiction. He gestured with his chin toward the broken piece of plastic in her hand. And when you attempt to force entry into a private residence, well, that's just breaking and entering. That's a matter for the county sheriff, who, as it happens, is waiting at the end of your driveway. Brenda's eyes darted toward the road, and for the first time, she saw the two dark, unmarked sedans parked discreetly behind a thicket of pines. Her entire body began to tremble. Her carefully constructed reality had completely dissolved. "My doc," Ethan said, stepping forward with the leather folio in his hands. "The weeds, the birdhouse. You justified all of it with your bylaws." He opened the folio on the porch railing, revealing the beautiful hand-drawn 1958 plat map. He pointed to the elegant script at the bottom. This was the final, devastating knowledge bomb. This is the original covenant that governs every piece of property in this subdivision, Brenda. It predates your HOA by 4 decades. It guarantees permanent, grandfathered riparian rights and structural allowances to the original plots. Your bylaws, your aesthetic guidelines, your entire rule book. It has no legal authority to override this document. Every fine you levied against me, every threat you made regarding my property was legally baseless. Your power was an illusion you sold to people who were too scared to call your bluff. Brenda stared at the ancient map, the document that nullified her entire reign, and finally she broke. A dry, ragged sob escaped her lips. The queen had been deposed. Her castle was a house of cards, and a gale-force wind had just arrived. The following weeks were a quiet, efficient storm. State investigators descended on Serenity Cove, their calm, professional presence a stark contrast to Brenda's chaotic rule. They interviewed the garrisons, who wept with relief as they gave their statements. They took testimony from Mr. Chen, who provided a precise, damning chronology of years of harassment. They audited the HOA's books, uncovering a web of embezzlement and self-dealing that implicated not just Brenda but her two cronies on the board, Gary and Carol, who turned on her immediately in exchange for plea bargains. Brenda and her husband were indicted on multiple state and federal charges. The news of the county commissioner's corruption sent shockwaves through the local political scene. His career was over. Their beige McMansion went on the market, a quiet monument to their spectacular downfall. The illegal assessment was, of course, nullified, and a court order mandated that all fines collected under the selective enforcement scheme over the past 5 years be repaid to the residents with interest. Ethan called a new community meeting. This time, the clubhouse didn't smell of fear. It smelled of coffee and possibility. He stood at the front, not as a pariah, but as a liberator. He didn't propose a new set of rules. Instead, he educated them. He explained their rights. He showed them how to amend their bylaws to strip the board of its tyrannical power, how to install oversight and transparency, and how to ensure that no one could ever again weaponize the rules against their neighbors. For the first time, the residents of Serenity Cove weren't subjects. They were citizens. Months passed. The oppressive heat of summer gave way to the crisp, clean air of autumn. The Ozark Hills blazed with color, the reds and golds reflected in the calm, clear water of the lake. Ethan was on his dock, his grandfather's dock. He'd replaced a few boards, reinforced a piling, but it was fundamentally the same. It was a testament to endurance. He was sitting on the edge, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, watching the morning mist burn off the water, when he heard a soft footstep on the path behind him. It was Helen Garrison. Her face, which had been etched with worry, now seemed lighter, her smile genuine. She was holding something in her hands. It was a small wooden birdhouse, painted a cheerful, vibrant blue. It was the birdhouse. She had found it in his shed, sanded it down, and given it a fresh, loving coat of paint. "Arthur and I thought it was time this went back up," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She held it out to him. "We thought your grandmother would like to see it back where it belongs." Ethan took the birdhouse. The smooth, cool wood felt solid in his hands. He looked from the small, simple gift to the vast, peaceful lake. He had come here seeking sanctuary, a quiet place to escape the world's conflicts. He'd found a war instead, but in winning it, he had found something more valuable than peace. He had found purpose. He had restored not just his own rights, but the dignity of his neighbors. He had honored his grandfather's legacy by defending the sanctuary he'd built. The fight had taught him that true serenity wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the courage to face it when it comes for you. It was the strength to stand up, not just for yourself, but for those who can't. His battle was over, but he knew that all across the country, thousands of other Brendas were terrorizing, thousands of other communities. His work was just beginning. If you believe that no one is above the law and that every homeowner deserves to live in peace, hit that subscribe button. Like this video, and share it with someone who needs to see that it's possible to fight back and win. Your story could be next. Comment your own HOA horror story below, and let's expose every corrupt HOA one takedown at a time. Together, we can make sure justice is more than just a word in a legal document. It's a reality in every community.